The candles in the ballroom of Ashcombe House burned low and gold that night, and it was under their light that the Duke of Ellesmere turned from his wife's outstretched hand and said, quite plainly, so that a dozen ears might carry it to 100 more by morning, "Kiss her hand instead." He did not raise his voice, he rarely did, but the words landed with the particular cruelty of things said calmly, and the Duchess of Ellesmere, who had crossed half the ballroom floor with her heart arranged carefully on her face, for perhaps the first time since her wedding, felt the whole room go still around her, the way a pond stills before a stone. She did not cry. She had long ago decided that she would not give this house the satisfaction of her tears, not even now, not even here, with the Dowager Marchioness of Vale standing between them in her silver gown, her gloved hand still lifted expectantly toward the Duke, as though she were a queen awaiting tribute and the Duchess merely an inconvenient obstacle in the path of it. Margaret Ellesmere, who had been born Margaret Colworth, of a falling-down manor, with a leaking roof and a father who could not manage his own accounts, looked at her husband's face and found there the same composed indifference he had worn on the morning after their wedding, when he had thanked her for her signature on the settlement papers, as though she were a solicitor rather than a bride. She lowered her hand. She smiled, because smiling cost her nothing now, and denied the room its spectacle. And then, with a grace that would be spoken of in undertones in 3 counties by the end of the month, she leaned forward, pressed her lips once to her husband's cheek in a kiss that everyone would later agree looked exactly like a farewell, and said, so quietly that only he could hear it, "Then I shall not trouble you for anything further, Your Grace." She left before the musicians had finished the movement. She left before her cloak had been properly fetched, walking out into the cold Ellesmere night in her ballroom slippers, and she did not look back at the lit windows of the house that had never, not for one single day of the 12 months she had lived in it, felt like her own. If you have ever loved someone who mistook your tenderness for weakness, who took your reaching hand and taught it, cruelly and precisely, to stop reaching, you will understand exactly what the Duchess felt as she walked away from Ashcombe House that night, and why it took the Duke of Ellesmere the better part of a year to learn what he had thrown away in a single sentence, said calmly, under gold candlelight, in front of everyone who mattered and no one who loved him. It had not always been so cold between them, though it had also never, if one were honest, been warm in any way that society would recognize as a love match. Julian Ashcombe, 7th Duke of Ellesmere, had married Margaret Colworth 11 months before that ball, for reasons that both of them understood perfectly, and neither of them had ever once discussed aloud. His estates, vast and ancient and mortgaged in ways his father had never confessed to him until the old man was 3 days from death, required capital that could only be found through a very particular kind of marriage. Not a fortune married in, precisely, for the Colworths had none to speak of, but a name old enough, and a woman sensible enough, that the transaction might be dressed as a match of equals rather than what it truly was, which was a drowning man reaching for the nearest steady hand. Margaret's father, Sir Edmund Colworth, had spent a lifetime demonstrating that gentility and competence were not the same inheritance, and it had fallen to his daughter, from the age of 16, to keep the estate ledgers from total collapse through sheer force of arithmetic and will. She had done this quietly, without complaint, the way she did most things, and it was this quiet competence, reported to Julian second-hand through his solicitor, through a mutual acquaintance who had seen her manage a tenant dispute with more shrewdness than most stewards twice her age. He had met her exactly twice before the wedding. Once at a dinner where she had said almost nothing, and once in his own study, where she had corrected an error in his own steward's projected yields with a single raised eyebrow and a column of figures written neatly in the margin, and he had watched her do it and thought, with the detached appraisal of a man assessing horseflesh, that she would do very well. He had not thought even once to ask himself whether he might come to love her, because he had built the entire architecture of his adult life around the conviction that love was a debt collected by people who had no right to it, and he intended never again to owe anyone that particular sum. 3 years before his marriage to Margaret, Julian had been engaged to a woman named Cassandra Pierrepont, the daughter of an earl, a woman of considerable beauty and considerable wit, and he had loved her, foolishly, completely, one in the reckless, unguarded way that only a young man who has never been disappointed can love, and she had broken the engagement 11 days before the wedding to marry a marquess with twice his income, and had done so, moreover, with a letter so cheerfully unapologetic that Julian had burned it rather than keep it as evidence of his own idiocy. He had rebuilt himself after that in the manner of a man rebuilding a house after a fire, efficiently, without sentiment, replacing what had been ornamental with what was merely load-bearing. By the time Margaret Colworth walked down the aisle of the Ellesmere Chapel in her mother's altered wedding dress, Julian Ashcombe had not permitted himself an unguarded feeling in 3 years, and he saw no reason his marriage should require one now. He had been, in the early months, unfailingly correct with her. He had given her the run of the house, had deferred to her on matters of the estate's tenant farms once he discovered, with the same detached appraisal, though warmer now, though closer to something he would not have named admiration, that her judgment in such matters exceeded his own. He had never been unkind to her, not in any way that could be named or reported. He had simply never once let her pass the wall he had built, brick by careful brick, around the part of himself that had once loved a woman foolishly and been made a fool for it. Margaret, for her part, had not expected love when she married him, but she had not expected to want it either, and that had been the trouble. She had expected a transaction and had been prepared to live inside it with the same discipline she had brought to her father's ledgers, find the balance, keep the books, ask for nothing that was not owed. What she had not anticipated was Julian himself, the particular gravity of him, the way he listened when she spoke of drainage systems and crop rotations as though her opinion were the only one in the room worth having, the rare unguarded half-smile he gave when she said something that amused him, as though he had not meant to permit it. She had watched him with his ward, a solemn 8-year-old boy named Thomas, who was the orphaned son of Julian's late cousin and who lived at Ashcombe House under his guardianship, and she had seen a gentleness in him there that he showed almost nowhere else. The way one thinks a dangerous thought one is trying not to think, I could love this man if he would let me. She had begun, over the months, to try. Small things at first, a book left on his desk that she thought he might enjoy, a request that he join her on her rounds of the tenant cottages, an unguarded laugh she let slip when he made a dry remark about the vicar's sermon that she suspected he had intended only for himself to hear. He had not rebuffed these overtures precisely. He had simply met them with a kind of gentle, immovable formality, the way a wall meets rain, absorbing nothing, letting it all run off towards some other, safer ground. She had told herself for months that this was simply his nature, that some men were built without the capacity for warmth, the way some soil could not hold water, and that she must be content with correctness where she could not have affection. It was Thomas, in the end, who had convinced her otherwise. The boy had come to her one evening in the garden, where she liked to sit with her account books among the roses his mother had planted before her death, had asked her, with the terrible directness of children, why his uncle never called her by her Christian name. "He calls Mrs. Hale by her name," the boy had said, referring to the housekeeper, "and he calls me Thomas, and he even calls his horse Peregrine. But he calls you my wife, or the Duchess, as though you hadn't got one." Margaret had laughed, because the alternative was something else entirely, and had told the boy that some grown people were simply formal by nature. But she had gone to bed that night, turning the boy's words over like a stone in her palm, and had understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning, that her husband had built something between them on purpose, and that she had spent nearly a year mistaking his careful construction for simple reticence. It was in the month that followed that Margaret began, quietly, to press against the wall, testing not its strength but its purpose, wanting to know if it was truly immovable or if it had simply never been asked to move. She began joining Julian in his study in the evenings under the pretext of the estate books, and found that he welcomed the company even as he kept the conversation scrupulously to yields and rents and the price of wool. She began once to ask him directly about Cassandra Pierpont, not out of jealousy, for she had heard the story only in fragments from Mrs. Beer Hale, who told it with the particular relish of a woman who had witnessed the aftermath and never forgiven the perpetrator, but because she wanted to understand the shape of the wound before she tried to touch it. Julian had gone very still at the name, had set down his pen with a precision that told her more than any words could have, and had said only, "That is not a subject I discuss," in a tone that closed the door so completely she had not tried it again for months. And yet she had noticed, in the small hours of ordinary life, the ways he seemed to be quietly, involuntarily thawing. He began seeking her opinion before it was offered. He began once to reach across the breakfast table and refill her tea, before she had asked, a gesture so small it would have meant nothing from another man, and meant everything from him. He began, and this was the detail she would return to, months later, turning it over like a keepsake, leaving the door of his study open on the evenings she was expected to walk past it, when for the first 6 months of their marriage he had always kept it closed. She had begun to believe, cautiously the way one believes a bridge will hold before one has fully tested its weight, that something was changing between them, that the correctness was softening at its edges into something that might, with enough patient tending, grow into what she wanted, which was simply to be loved by her own husband, plainly and without reservation, the way he loved Thomas, the way he must once have loved Cassandra Pierpont. Before she taught him it was dangerous. The public test of all this quiet hope had come. Such tests so often do, at precisely the moment Margaret had allowed herself to believe it might not be necessary. The Dowager Marchioness of Vale held influence over 3 seats in Parliament that Julian's political allies required, and her goodwill cultivated over decades, brittle and easily offended, was not a thing to be casually spent. Julian had explained this to Margaret before the ball with the careful, faintly apologetic thoroughness of a man briefing a colleague rather than confiding in a wife, and Margaret, who understood the arithmetic of obligation better than most, had agreed readily enough to be gracious to the woman. She had not anticipated that the test would come at her own expense, in a gesture so small and so human that she had not even recognized it as a risk until it was too late to withdraw it. She had crossed the ballroom toward Julian, meaning only to touch his arm before the Marchioness arrived, a small private gesture of affection, before the evening's business began, the kind of gesture she had begun, in her cautious testing of the wall, to believe he might not mind, and the Marchioness had arrived a half-step before her. Gloved hand extended for the ritual greeting, and Julian, reading the room with the political precision that had kept his family's fortunes afloat for 7 generations, had seen his wife's hand rising toward him and the Marchioness's hand rising toward air, and had made in the space of half a second, "Kiss her hand instead," he had said, meaning only, in the frantic arithmetic of that instant, that Margaret's affectionate reach should be redirected into the correct social gesture toward the more urgently important woman, a redirection of manners. But he had said it in front of the room in a voice utterly without warmth at the exact moment his wife's hand was extended toward him in an act of unguarded feeling she had spent months building the courage to offer, and the effect, whatever he had intended, was to take the single most vulnerable gesture Margaret had made in the whole of their marriage and correct it publicly as though it had been a breach of etiquette rather than an offering of love. Margaret understood, standing there with her hands still lifted and slowly falling, that she had misread everything. Not the facts, she was too honest with herself for that kind of comfortable lie, but the meaning beneath them, the open study door, the refilled teacup, the small softening she had charted so carefully over months. These had not been the thawing of a wall, but merely, she thought now, the ordinary courtesies a decent man extends to a wife he has no objection to and no love for either. She had built a whole hopeful architecture on the foundation of his politeness, and he had just demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, that when a choice had to be made between her feelings and his obligations, her feelings would always come second, would in fact be treated as a kind of embarrassment to be managed rather than a gift to be received. She did not make a scene. She had spent a lifetime learning not to make scenes, first for her father's sake, and now, it seemed, for her husband's. She simply smiled, delivered her farewell kiss and her quiet parting words, and walked out of Ashcombe House into the cold, with the particular calm of a woman who has finally stopped hoping for something and discovered, to her own surprise, that the absence of hope feels almost like relief. She did not go far, only to Colworth Grange, her father's old house, some 4 hours' ride from Ashcombe, where Sir Edmund still lived in diminished but comfortable circumstances on the income Margaret's marriage had secured him. She arrived past midnight in her ruined ballroom slippers with no luggage and no explanation beyond a request that her old room be made up, and her father, whatever his faults, had the sense not to ask questions of a daughter who had clearly walked through some private disaster and wished only to be left in peace. She wrote to Mrs. Many Hale the following morning requesting that her trunks be sent on, and to Thomas a short warm letter explaining nothing of substance but promising to write to him regularly, because whatever had broken between herself and Julian, she had no intention of letting it break the boy's heart as well. She did not write to Julian at all. There seemed to her nothing left to say that the ballroom had not already said with perfect clarity. At Ashcombe House, the days that followed Margaret's departure passed for Julian with the strange, delayed quality of an injury not yet fully felt. He had gone through the remainder of the ball as though nothing had happened, had made his farewells to the Marchioness with every appearance of composure, had returned home and gone to bed without once permitting himself to examine what he had done, because to examine it fully would have required admitting a fear he had spent 3 years building an entire life around, avoiding. It was only the following morning, finding the house strangely quiet, finding Margaret's chair at breakfast empty, and her account book still open on the study desk to a column she had not finished totaling, that the shape of what he had done began slowly to assert itself. Mrs. Hale informed him, with the flat, disapproving formality of a servant who has decided her employer has behaved badly and does not intend to soften the news, that her Grace had departed for Colworth Grange before dawn and had left instructions for her trunks to follow. Julian received this information the way a man receives a diagnosis he has half suspected and wholly dreaded, and he told himself in the first hours that this was merely a temporary pique, that Margaret was a sensible woman, and would return once she had had time to reconsider an overreaction to a perfectly reasonable social necessity. He told himself this for 3 days, through 3 days of a house that seemed, without her in it, to have lost some essential quality of warmth he had not consciously noticed accumulating. It was Thomas who first refused to let him continue believing it. The boy had taken Margaret's absence hard in the unguarded way of children who have not yet learned to disguise their grief as indifference, and on the 4th evening he had come to Julian's study, the door of which Julian had, without quite noticing, begun closing again, and had asked, with the same terrible directness he had once used on Margaret in the garden, whether his uncle had made the Duchess go away. Julian had tried at first the evasions of adults, that her Grace was visiting her father, that she would return in due course, that such things were not for Thomas to worry over. But the boy had looked at him with an expression so like his mother's, Julian's late cousin, whom he had loved as a sister, that Julian found he could not sustain the evasion. "I heard you," Thomas said, "at the ball. I was not meant to be awake, but I was, and I heard what you said to her, and I saw her face, and I do not think she is coming back, unless you go and fetch her." Julian had sat with that accusation for a long time after the boy had gone to bed, turning it over in the particular silence of a study that no longer had anyone in it to fill the open door, and had found to his own considerable discomfort that he could not construct a version of events in which the boy was wrong. It was his aunt, Lady Augusta Fitzwilliam, arriving unannounced a week later with the particular briskness of a woman who has heard a story second-hand and intends to hear it properly first-hand, who forced the reckoning Thomas had only begun. Augusta had been a fixture of Julian's childhood, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her own illusions, and she possessed the rare gift of saying difficult things plainly, without cruelty, in a way that made them impossible to ignore. She sat across from Julian in his study, refused his offer of tea, and said, "I have heard 3 different accounts of what happened at the Vale Ball, and they cannot all be true, so you will tell me the 4th, which is presumably the accurate one, and then you will tell me why my nephew, whom I raised to have better manners than his father, humiliated a good woman in front of the one person in England most likely to repeat it with embellishments," Julian told her. He told the story flatly, factually, the way he might report a business transaction, and Augusta listened without interrupting until he had finished, and then she said, in the gentle but unsparing voice she had used on him since he was a boy of 7, grieving his mother, "You did not do this because of the Marchioness. You did it because Margaret reached for you in front of a room full of people, and some frightened part of you that has never healed since Cassandra Pierpont decided it was safer to correct her than to be seen accepting what she offered. You have spent 3 years building a fortress to keep yourself from being made a fool of by love again, and you have just discovered that a fortress cannot tell the difference between an enemy and a wife." Julian had not answered this for a long moment, because there was nothing in it he could honestly refute, and Augusta, seeing that her arrow had found its mark, pressed further. "The question now," she said, "is whether you intend to remain safe inside your fortress for the rest of your life, alone and correct and untouched, or whether you intend to go and be a fool for a woman who, from everything I have heard of her, deserves rather better than the performance you gave her at that ball." The public reckoning came before Julian had fully resolved what he meant to do about the private one, the form of Cassandra Pierpont herself, now the Marchioness of Fenimore. Her second marriage having ended her first husband's fortune rather faster than his life, who arrived at a dinner party in London, 3 weeks after the ball, having heard the story in every one of its embellished versions and finding it, evidently, delicious. She cornered Julian by the window with the particular relish of a woman revisiting old conquests, and said, with false sympathy that fooled no one, that she had always known his marriage was a practical arrangement rather than a true match, and that perhaps it was for the best that he had reminded his little Duchess of her proper place before she got ideas above her station. It was in the white heat of his own answering anger not at Margaret, he realized with some surprise, but on her behalf, that Julian understood the full shape of what he had done and what he had nearly let stand uncorrected. "My wife," he said, in a voice that carried further than he intended and drew the attention of half the room, "has more competence, more integrity, and more genuine feeling in the whole of her character than you managed to show me in the entirety of our acquaintance. And if I spoke to her carelessly at Lady Vale's ball, and I intend to spend whatever time is required correcting it." Cassandra's smile had frozen and then cracked, and the room, which had been listening with the particular attentiveness of society scenting a story, absorbed this new version of events with visible interest, and Julian understood, walking home that night, that he had just done in public what he ought to have done a month earlier in private. He had chosen Margaret, plainly in front of witnesses, and it had cost him nothing at all compared to what his earlier silence had cost her. He rode for Colworth Grange the following morning without writing ahead, because he had learned, in the weeks of turning the matter over, that a letter could be composed and revised until it said something safe, and he did not trust himself to write anything safe when what was required was something true. He arrived in the late afternoon, travel-stained and unannounced, to find Sir Edmund's steward reluctant to admit him and Margaret herself, informed of his arrival, choosing to receive him not in the good parlour with its careful formalities, but in the estate office among the ledgers, as though she meant to remind him from the first moment exactly what kind of woman he had married and exactly what kind of welcome he might expect. She stood behind the desk when he entered, her hands folded before her, her face composed in the particular stillness he now recognized, having had a month to study his own mistake from every angle, as the same discipline she had once brought to bear on her father's failing accounts. The discipline of a woman absorbing a blow without permitting herself. "The luxury of visibly staggering your grace," she said, and the formality of it landed exactly as she intended it to. A small blade returned to its owner. "I did not expect you." "I did not expect myself for some time," Julian said, and found that his rehearsed opening, some careful diplomatic explanation of the Marchioness and the politics and the pressures of the evening, had entirely deserted him now that he stood in front of her, and what came instead was simply the truth, unpolished. "I have come to apologize, and I find I do not know how to do it well, because I have never truly done it before. Not to anyone. I have spent 3 years believing that if I never again reached for anything, I could never again have it taken from me, and I built our marriage. I am ashamed to say this, but it is true, as another version of that same fortress. I told myself I was being fair to you, giving you correctness instead of false sentiment, when, in truth, I was simply protecting myself, and, at the ball, when you reached for me in front of everyone. Some old wounded part of me that still remembers exactly what it felt like to be made a fool of by love decided it was safer to humiliate you than to let the room see that your affection meant something to me. It did mean something. It has meant everything for months, and I was too great a coward to say so until I very nearly lost the chance to say it at all." Margaret did not answer immediately. She had imagined in the weeks since the ball a dozen versions of an apology from Julian, and had steeled herself against all of them, certain that whatever he offered would be some further exercise in careful correctness, an apology composed the way he composed everything else, at a safe remove from actual feeling. What he had just given her instead was so plainly unguarded, so entirely unlike the man who had spent a year keeping the study door closed, that she found her carefully maintained composure wavering for the first time since she had walked out of Ashcombe House. "You let me believe," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt, "for 11 months, that I was a business arrangement you tolerated. I built hope out of very small things, an open door, a refilled teacup, because you gave me nothing larger to build it from. And then, at the one moment I finally trusted that hope enough to act on it, you took it from me in front of the one room in England most likely to make certain everyone heard how little I mattered to you. I do not know how to simply set that aside, because you have ridden 4 hours and found better words than you have ever given me before." "I am not asking you to simply set it aside," Julian said. "I am asking you to let me earn back, slowly if you will permit it, what I threw away carelessly in a single sentence. I do not deserve your trust, returned to me whole and undamaged, merely because I have finally found the courage to say what I ought to have said months ago. I am asking only for the chance to try, and I will accept whatever conditions you set on that chance, because they will certainly be more generous than I have any right to expect." It was Margaret's turn, then, to offer the vulnerability she had guarded as carefully as he had guarded his own, and she found, once she began, that it came more easily than she had feared. "I have been afraid, this whole marriage," she said, "that I was merely convenient, that you had chosen me the way one chooses a sound horse or a well-built house for practical qualities rather than any feeling, and that I would spend the whole of my life keeping your accounts and warming your bed, and never once being loved, the way I watched you love Thomas, freely and without calculation. I told myself I could be content with correctness because I had grown up believing that a woman in my position had no right to ask for more than that. But I found, somewhere in the last months, that I did want more, and wanting it frightened me nearly as much as it seems to have frightened you, because I did not know what I would do with the disappointment if I asked, and was refused." "You were never merely convenient," Julian said, and the plainness of it, the total absence of his usual careful qualification, was itself a kind of proof. "I chose you first, for practical reasons. That is true, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I came to love you, Margaret, somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of evenings in that study, and I was too great a fool, and too great a coward, to say it until the fear of losing you entirely finally outweighed the fear of being made vulnerable by saying it aloud." They stood for a long moment in the estate office among the ledgers Margaret had grown up balancing, and Julian, watching her face for some sign of what she meant to do with what he had offered, found himself unable to bear the silence any longer. "I do not intend to make you a speech," he said. "I have made speeches to Parliament and speeches to bankers, and I do not think either kind is what you deserve. Simply say this, plainly, the way you have always deserved to hear it. I love you. I want you to come home, not because the house requires a duchess or the ledgers require balancing, but because I have discovered, in the month you have been gone, that Ashcombe House, without you in it, is merely a large, cold building, and that Thomas asks after you every day. Manage to sit in that study without noticing the particular silence where you used to be." Margaret felt the careful discipline she had maintained since the ballroom finally, quietly, give way, not into tears, though her eyes were bright, but into something gentler, a loosening she had not permitted herself in a month of careful composure. "I will come home," she said, "but I will not come home to the same silence. Julian, I will not spend another year building hope out of small unspoken gestures, because you cannot bring yourself to say plainly what you feel. If you love me, you will have to say so, not once, in a desperate ride to Colworth Grange, but ordinarily, regularly, the way one says true things that do not frighten one any more. Then I will say it every day, if that is what is required, Julian said, starting now and continuing for as long as you will permit me to say it, which I hope, though I do not presume, will be the whole of our lives together. Margaret allowed herself, then, the smallest smile, not the composed social smile she had given the ballroom, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes, and crossed the estate office to stand before him, and this time it was Julian who reached first, taking her hand, ungloved now, ink-stained faintly from her father's accounts, and pressing his lips to it with a deliberateness that acknowledged plainly everything the gesture had once been made to mean, and everything it could mean now instead. "Kiss her hand," he said quietly, and the words that had once been a public wound became, in that small office among the ledgers, something else entirely. A private vow, offered without an audience, meant only for her. They returned to Ashcombe House together 3 days later, having spent that time at Colworth Grange in the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust in small, ordinary increments, long walks through her father's neglected grounds, during which Julian asked and genuinely wished to know her opinions on matters that had nothing to do with duty, quiet evenings in which he told her, haltingly at first, and then with increasing ease, the full history of Cassandra Pierpont and the wound it had left, not as an excuse, but as an accounting, so that she might understand fully the shape of what she had married and what she had, with such patience, been slowly healing without either of them fully realizing it. Thomas ran to meet their carriage before it had properly stopped, and Margaret, climbing down, caught the boy up in an embrace that told him more plainly than any letter could have that she had not left because of anything he had done. Mrs. M. Ale, watching from the doorway, with the particular satisfaction of a servant whose employer has finally come to his senses, remarked to the under-housekeeper only that it was about time, and returned to her duties with visibly lighter step. The study door from that evening forward remained open, not merely on the evenings Margaret was expected to pass it, but always as a kind of standing invitation that required no further explanation. The seasons turned as they do from the sharp cold of that winter ball into a spring that arrived at Ashcombe with unusual warmth, and Margaret took to spending her mornings in the garden Julian's late cousin had planted, the roses climbing thick and fragrant along the old stone wall that had once marked in some unspoken way the boundary of what she was permitted to want from her marriage, and now marked nothing at all beyond the ordinary edge of a garden well tended. Julian took to joining her there before his morning correspondence, a habit that began, in the first months after her return, as a small deliberate effort, and became, within a year, so thoroughly ordinary that neither of them remarked on it any longer, which was, Margaret often thought, the truest measure of how far they had come. Once so carefully rationed and so painfully withheld, had become simply the unremarkable weather of their daily life together. Thomas grew from a solemn, watchful boy into a solemn, watchful young man who would tell the story decades later to his own children of the winter his aunt had walked out of a ballroom in her dancing slippers, and his uncle had ridden 4 hours to fetch her back, and would always add that he had known, even at 8 years old, listening at a door he was not meant to be behind, that his uncle would come to his senses eventually, because some things, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen again. It was 5 years after that winter ball, on the occasion of their own daughter's christening, that Julian gave the toast that would be remembered in the family's private history as the true accounting of everything the ballroom had nearly cost them. He raised his glass to Margaret across the assembled company of family and friends, Augusta present and satisfied, Thomas now 13, and solemnly proud in his role as godfather. Even Mrs. Hale permitted a chair at the edge of the gathering as the old and valued friend she had become. He said, "I once told my wife, in front of a room much like this one, to kiss another woman's hand instead of mine. It very nearly cost me the only thing in my life I have ever truly wanted. I will not make that mistake again." To my wife, who taught me that the things worth having are the things worth reaching for in front of everyone, and who forgave a fool for taking a year longer than he should have to learn it. Margaret, holding their daughter, met his eyes across the table with the particular warmth of a woman who has watched a wall come down brick by patient brick and found on the other side of it exactly the man she had always hoped was there, and she thought, as she had thought many times in the 5 years since that cold ballroom night, that some hands are worth reaching for even when they are refused, because the reaching itself is a kind of faith, and faith patiently kept is very often rewarded in the end, not with grand declarations, but with small, ordinary mornings in a garden, a study door left open, and a hand that no longer needed to be told to reach for hers, because it simply always did.